Yesterday we covered the Bevy CLI, and in the follow-up to the Bevy Game Jam number 6, today we're going to talk about the Bevy new 2D template. Now on the left-hand side here, you can see the Bevy flock Bevy new 2D, which is where all of the source code for this template lives. If you're interested in diving deeper than this video goes over, there's a bunch of documentation in the README, as well as things that we aren't going to cover, such as installing Linux dependencies. So let's kick it off and get started with the Bevy CLI. We're going to do Bevy new -t2d. That gives us this 2D template because it starts with Bevy _new inside of the Bevy flock organization. And I'm going to name my game my 2D game. The first thing we're asked to do is enter your itch.io username. This is a template that is often used for the Game Jam, and the Game Jam is hosted on itch.io. So if you want to deploy to an itch.io project, you're going to want to put in your username here. The second question is enter the project name used in the itch.io URL. You can guess at this currently, or you can take a second to go to itch.io and create a new project. So if I go to itch.io and I click create new project, I end up on this page, which has a whole bunch of stuff. I can give it a title, which then will automatically give it a URL here. And this is actually what we need. Now there's a whole bunch of stuff you can click here, the genre, the description, generative AI disclosure is going to be no for me, as well as like community and visibility and things like that. One of the other things I'm going to change here is actually change the release status from released to in development. Another option would be prototype as well. Under kind of project, you can specify this is downloadable, HTML, etc. I'm going to use HTML here because if you're participating in the Bevy Game Jam, the way to get the most people to play your game and thus vote for your game is to actually make sure it runs on the web. So my project, when you land on the homepage, should be giving you something to play, not something to download. And with that, I can save and view the page, but you can see there's immediately an issue. There was a problem loading the project. And that's because here we didn't upload anything. Keep that in mind for later, but we don't need to do it right now. So I'll take this URL here under project URL and I'll put that into the project name for my template. And then the template, after generating a bunch of files, will ask to run a command, cargo update package my 2D game. This is a fairly harmless command. It's just a cargo update command. This is exactly what it's going to run, and it'll update the cargo lock file. So all things considered, because I took a deviation over to itch, it took us about 5 minutes to get this done. It should take you a little bit less time. Let's get into this repo and take a look at one of the first things you're going to want to do, which is actually not running the game. If you open this in VS Code, there's a whole bunch of different configurations and stuff, but I personally don't plan on installing any of those recommended plugins, so I'm just going to close out that recommendation. All of that information is in this .vs code directory or .idea. What we just saw specifically is in this extensions JSON recommendations here. These are a bunch of extensions. There's a bunch of that kind of configuration in this project. But for us, for right now, it's more important that we have a couple of GitHub workflows. So if we full screen this, we can see there's a ci.yaml and a release.yaml. These are going to be very important if you're participating in the Bevy Game Jam. Going through the steps, you can basically see it's checking out the repository, installing a Rust toolchain, checking the formatting of your project, doing some documentation checks and stuff like that, running Clippy, running Bevy lints, running tests, and for CI, just checking that the web build compiles. The one we're more interested in is the release workflow, which if you look at the release.yaml, notably it says on push tags. So you're going to have to create a tag with this format, which is semver, so it's like v0.0.1 or something like that. Nothing strange, but you're going to have to create a git tag to get this release workflow to fire. And you can see that my 2D game, the name that we inserted when we started this template, is here. The upload to itch is Chris Biscardi, my 2D game, etc. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff in here that we're not going to go over specifically, but it's basically doing the same thing. Now, while we're in here, we will actually end up needing this Butler credentials. This Butler credentials is going to be our basically itch.io API key, and Butler is a CLI that's going to upload our zip file for us. We're going to need to go to settings, that's here on the bottom left in the dropdown. We'll scroll all the way down, go to developer API keys. I'm going to have to enter my password again. I already got some API keys. I'm not going to show them to you, obviously, but I'll generate a new one here 0 seconds ago. And then I'm going to copy this and we're going to go create a new Git repo. So over on GitHub, we're going to do owner, Christopher Biscardi in this case, repository name, my 2D game. And that's really all we need here. If you want to, you can choose a license. MIT is a good option. Bevy ecosystem projects tend to be either Apache 2 or MIT or dual licensed under both. But in general, the Game Jam is a nice way to kind of show the source code for your games. And if you want people to be able to actually use it, you do have to give a license for them to actually use it. So we've got our repository here. Unfortunately, it sticks the license file in here. So we will have to pull that down. And we need to go into settings, into secrets and variables, actions. We can go into environment secrets, click new environment, and we can go to repository secrets here, click new repository secret. In this case, remember it's called Butler credentials. Make sure you spell this right because we're going to need it to be spelled right. And then drop your API key here in secret. I'm not going to show you that part because it's my API secret. Once you add that, you'll get repository secret added, and you'll get a little output here at the bottom. So we'll have to go to this little code drop down here, grab our remote. We'll do git remote add origin that git URL. I'll run a git pull origin main. Then I'm just going to shove everything that we have here with git add, or rather git add dot. That gives everything, git commit first, git push u origin main. And if we go look at our repo on the left here, we can see that we have all of our files. We've got a pending CI workflow happening. So if we go to actions, we can see first happening over here. I'm actually going to cancel this because I don't want it to run, because what I actually want to do is git tag v0.0.1, and I'm going to do git push -- tags. And instead of running CI, the first action I want to run is that release workflow. So the first one it tried to trigger was CI because we pushed a commit to main, but the one that I actually want to test is the release workflow because I want it to try to go to itch. So you can see if you click into this action, there's a couple things happening here, including a build for a couple of different platforms. If you don't plan on providing downloads, you can get rid of a couple of these. Now, GitHub actions tend to be a little bit underpowered, so we'll let this run off to the side. And in the meantime, we'll start talking about the actual code that we have here. So the first thing we want to do, because we're going to deploy this to the web, we're going to do Bevy run web. We use the Bevy CLI to set up this project. We want to test this project on the web so that if we add new crates or do anything to our project, we want to make sure that our application still runs on the web the whole time we're developing it. This makes it significantly easier in general to make sure that you're not getting yourself into a hole in case you do something that is, a native only feature. The last thing you want to do is work on a game, make the thing you're proud of, and then realize that because you weren't testing on web the entire time, that it actually doesn't run on itch for some reason. So if we open up localhost 4000 after building our application with Bevy run web, I can trigger a reload here. We get a little loading spinner, a little Bevy logo flash, and then a menu. This menu has 3 buttons. First, it's got a credits page, and we can go back, and then we've got a settings page, which only has master volume at the current moment, but does work. This game does have audio, but I am not going to play it for you in this video, I don't think. And then, of course, we can hit play here. And when we hit play, we get an animated duck. This is a sprite sheet animation with a texture atlas, and we can walk around with WASD. If we go off to the left, it should loop around to the side. If we go off to the top, it should loop around to the bottom. And if we hit escape, the game will pause. We'll get continue settings and quit to title. Again, settings being like the master volume and stuff. And we can continue playing the game and go back to the title. Now, there is something also pretty interesting here. This UI doesn't show it off all that much, but if you hit backtick, you will be able to see the UI debug layout. So the purple or pink or magenta or whatever you want to call it on the outside is the root node. And then each of these buttons is positioned inside of that root node with text inside of those. This can be very helpful when you're doing UI development. So if you hit backtick, it'll turn off. If you hit backtick, it'll turn back on. And you can see that it kind of goes away while we're playing. But if you bring up the pause menu, you can also see the UI debug. That UI debug is this UI debug resource, and we're just toggling this enabled on and off. Note that this also requires a feature flag to work. So if we go into source, and I get rid of our little web thing here, and we maybe make this bigger, we can go to a dev_tools, which is a file in this project. And you can see there's a system down here called toggle debug UI, run if, input just pressed, toggle key defined as key code backquote. And it's just taking that UI debug options resource and toggling it on and off. Now, there's probably some things here that are unfamiliar to you, even if you've written Bevy apps before, but let's take a quick look over at the main.rs before we dive into any more of the code. There's a couple of notable things about the main.rs. One is that it sets up the Bevy linter and handles some config flagging for the dev feature, which is that UI debug stuff. This config isn't super important. You can go read about it more in the Bevy linter docs. But basically this allows you to run either cargo check or cargo clippy instead of running Bevy lint. And that will make any Bevy lints that are present in your code known to cargo clippy and whatnot. But at the root of our project, we've got a new Bevy application. We add this app plugin and then we run it and that returns the app exit. This is fairly normal. If you go look at app plugin, you'll see it's a typical, very regular plugin definition. This is the plugin definition you'll see in the Bevy core repo, in most plugins, and in general is the most used plugin structure inside of the Bevy ecosystem. This gives us access to the application such that we can add our default plugins, which will instantiate the window and do other things like that, as well as some other plugins and some other code that we'll get into. The default plugins do some things that are useful for itch.io, since this is a Bevy Game Jam related repo. The asset plugin is configured to never check for meta files. There's a Git issue here that you can click if you want to go check out more about that. But basically, Bevy has the concept of like meta sidecar files. And on itch.io, due to the way that the web server is set up and some other things, the requests basically always happen. So this turns those requests off, which can be better. And then we set the window plugin. So these are overriding plugins and default plugins. We set the window plugin to have a name of the project name that we gave it and fit canvas to parent, which is useful for HTML deployments. There's a whole bunch of other plugins that get added here. These are all internal plugins. These are all like local to the 2D project. There is a system set called app systems that isn't strictly required, but the template authors have felt like this was useful enough to provide. Basically, what this means is that inside of update, you can add systems into these steps, if you will. And what that will do is run tick timers, then record input, then update. So it'll run any systems you register in tick timers, then any systems that you register in record update, then any systems that you register in app systems update. And it does this in order because we're chaining it and we're running that in the update schedule. If you're not familiar with Bevy yet, the update schedule is basically like the set of systems that run every frame. It also sets up a different system set. This one doesn't have a bunch of variants. It is only a single label, and it's related to the pause functionality. So we saw that in the application, we can run a pause when we're actually running the application. And this says anything that's in pausable systems should only run if pause is false. And pause here is actually a state. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we cover the pausing functionality. And then other than that, we get a camera spawned at startup. This is just a regular system all the way at the bottom. The only thing it does is this single spawn command, which spawns a camera 2D with the name camera. It can be pretty good practice to name your entities. Otherwise, you don't really have anything to refer to them from a development perspective. So if you use something like Bevy Inspector eGUI, if you don't give a name to your entities, what will show up is actually the entity like index and generation. So like 1v1 or like 5v4 or something like that. So this name, while not super important to do from a functionality perspective, can be super useful if you end up using something like Bevy Inspector eGUI. Now you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of like red here. If you're a previous developer of Bevy applications, you might have your own configuration for how to set up Rust Analyzer. In this case, because the 2D template comes with its own configurations for Rust Analyzer targeter behavior, I have to go into VS Code settings, this targeter, and comment this out. This will require a Rust Analyzer restart for me for VS Code, and then those little red warning squiggles will go away. So let's take a quick second to go check on our web build. This web build took the least time on, let's say, Linux at 7 minutes, and the most time on Windows at 14, macOS somewhere in the middle at like 10 or 11, and Wasm at 7. So you can see how if you're not going to produce a Windows build, that you might want to get rid of the Windows logic inside of this GitHub action, because you can actually produce a web build in about half the time. So all things considered, everything's green. It should have worked. And if we go to our game page, we can see that there's a macOS, a Windows, and a web.zip. Now it says my zip didn't have an index.html, so let me go check my actual web download here. So the first thing I'm going to do is come into my 2D game web.zip and make sure that this file will be played in the browser is checked, and then save and view page and make sure that that is not the issue, which it does seem to be like it is. So make sure you go into edit game here, go down to the things that you just uploaded from that GitHub action and make sure you select this file will be played in the browser for your web zip, or you will end up with the issue that I just had. So now we can run the game and we see it loading in. We see the Bevy logo hopefully show up in a second, and then we see our play and settings and whatnot. So now every time we push a tag to our Git repo, it should build and deploy to itch. This workflow is super important, especially if you are expecting to actually submit for the game jam. You should do this every once in a while. You can throw your itch page up in draft while you're doing this, so you don't have to show it to anybody until you're done. But I highly encourage you to ship to itch more often than not, at least once a day throughout the game jam. So let's go back to our code and continue looking at the actual application and what kind of patterns it uses. We've talked a little bit about main. We've seen the application run. We've deployed it to itch, but it is worth noting that there is more configuration that you can potentially do. Inside of the .cargo directory, there's a file called config fast builds, and this has a whole bunch of comments in it, so I'll let you read them if you're interested. But the thing that you want to do if you are going to use this is get rid of the words fast builds and just make this config.toml. You may need to fiddle with this a little bit, so I do encourage you to actually read what's going on here so that you understand in case you run into any issues. But if you want to, you can definitely enable some additional configuration, some different linkers, which should produce faster builds. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to leave it and not enable it. And then another sort of development time improvement that is a little bit more experimental is hot patching with sub-second. So if you go to the README for Bevy New 2D, we're not actually going to cover this working in practice because it's a little bit more advanced. I would suggest not doing this if you're building your first Bevy application. But if you're a little bit more experienced, if you know what's going on with Bevy, and you're interested in having Rust code hot reloading, then you should go check out this piece of documentation, which uses a crate called Bevy Simple Sub-Second System, which is based on some work from the Dioxis group. You need to add this dependency in, apply it to your native builds. I don't think it currently works in Wasm, so you will have to do native development if you want hot patching enabled. You do need to install things like the Dioxis CLI instead of Bevy or Cargo, but I have seen this work, and if you want to play with it, it is very cool. You basically can annotate your systems with hot, and then when you change them, they will basically hot update in under a second, reloading your Rust code while the application is running, which is very, very cool, but also very experimental. And I would only encourage you to use it if you're already familiar with Bevy and the kinds of errors you can see, because otherwise there is a risk of confusion here. So zooming out a bit, without getting too deep in the weeds of the actual code, there's a couple of patterns that are worth going over that exist inside of this template. We saw the standard way of creating plugins here. This is creating a struct, implementing the plugin trait for that struct, and then you get functions like build that you can implement. This is the way that the vast majority of plugins in the entire ecosystem are written. It's how all of the upstream plugins inside of the Bevy core repo are written. It's how all of the plugins in third-party crates are written, but there is another option. And this template has decided to make use of that option. So in this case, it looks a little bit different. This is app add plugins. These are module names, and these are the names of functions inside of those modules. So you end up with asset tracking plugin, or audio plugin, or demo plugin. And plugin, if we go look at the DevTools plugin, because we were just talking about DevTools, this is a function that accepts a mutable reference to an app or an exclusive reference to an app, and then can do whatever you find in the build function. So this is a strictly less functional version of creating a plugin, but the template has definitely decided to take this and use it everywhere possible. So inside of this template specifically, you'll see that kind of function plugin being used everywhere rather than the struct plugin. Regardless of which one you prefer, organizing code into plugins is a fundamental way of abstracting Bevy code. If you think of things in a spectrum from multiple files to multiple crates that you get from maybe crates.io, plugins is kind of like intermediary. It's more like the module system. So if we go into DevTools plugin, this is basically responsible for adding all of the dev tools that we would want. So this is logging the transitions for the screen state and also adding a system to toggle the debug UI using that backtick. And if you add this plugin to your application, like is done here, which can then be configured based on a single feature flag, then those systems all get added to your application. This can be a really, really, really solid way of managing the complexity of the ECS. In this case, we have things like dev tools in one plugin, menus in another, audio in a third. So if we go look at, say, asset tracking, you would expect that all of the systems and resources and component definitions and all of that kind of thing related to asset tracking are in this file. And in fact, they are. We can see that the app is initializing a resource, it's adding a system to pre-update, and so on and so forth. And there's this extra trait here and things like that. This file specifically happens to be a custom abstraction for handling the loading and checking of assets, but it is mostly fully encapsulated by this plugin. Similarly for audio, we can register our audio types and then add a system for applying the global volume if the global volume resource has changed, and you add this plugin either to your application or not, and you have audio or not. Another pattern that's worth being aware of is that this template uses mod.rs files, which is kind of an older method of organizing Rust code. So in this case, we're in screens mod.rs. And if we go up to main, which also notable, there's no lib.rs in this template at all. The reason there's no lib.rs in this template is because the Bevy sub-second hot reloading stuff that we talked about earlier doesn't currently work with lib.rs. And the authors of the template wanted to make sure that if you wanted to use the hot reloading, that this was set up to do that. So everything's stuffed into a single main.rs file. But if you're not using hot reloading, you're probably going to have a lib.rs as well. So in this case, it looks very much the same. We've got mod screens. This would look for a screens.rs file on the same level. So something like asset tracking, for example. You can see that mod asset tracking is here, and we've got asset tracking the file here right next to main.rs. This is the way that newer Rust code is typically written, but it's also valid for this main to look for screens in the directory here and look for this mod.rs file. It's kind of like an index.rs if you're familiar with JavaScript stuff or anything like that. It's basically the same thing. And then in here, we have the sort of like screens abstraction, if you will. The screen plugin initializes the screen state and adds a bunch more plugins. So the gameplay plugin, the loading plugin, the splash plugin, and the title plugin. Those are all in files right next to the mod.rs. And what ends up happening here is that the splash, title, loading, and gameplay screens, if you will, are states that you can transition from and to. So if we go into one of these, let's say the first one is splash. So let's go check out the splash plugin. That's in splash.rs here. This plugin inserts a clear color resource. It adds a spawn splash screen system when we enter the splash screen state, applies a number of timer ticks and updates that only run if the splash screen state is running. It inserts and removes splash screen timers based on whether we are entering the splash screen state or exiting. Those timers are also added to the system set that we saw before, and it lets you skip the splash screen if the player hits escape as well. So basically the pattern here is that they want you to put a screen in each different file. In each different file, you've got these on enter and on exit sort of transitions. So when you enter the splash screen state, you do some stuff. When you exit, you do some more stuff. While the state is running, you do other things. This is pretty typical, and it's the same with loading and gameplay, etc., etc. So that brings us into another pattern that this template uses. If you check at the theme widget file, you'll see a bunch of functions that return impl bundle. Impl bundle, or the ability to return impl bundle, is fairly new in 0.16. What this allows you to do is actually return a bundle from a function, which allows you to do things like create simple widgets. So for example, where in another UI environment, maybe you're used to writing, front end Vue or React or whatever code, you might have components. These will be functions that can accept arguments and return bundles that they can get spawned onto entities. In this case, we've got a header, widget or component or whatever you want to call it, named header, accepts some text, specifies a font size, and sets the color based on a constant. Now, a lot of these functions inside of the template will use something that's a little bit more production rusty, which is that you can pass in any argument that can be turned into a string. So if you're newer to Rust, you might write this as just a regular string or as a string slice or whatever you want to do. This is basically just a way to say, we have this into function, this text component is going to accept a string. Anything that you give us that can turn into a string is acceptable as an argument here. And in some cases, this gets even more complicated. Here's a button with 4 generics. We've got some text that can be turned into a string, an action that is I, which is an into observer system with another couple generics. And that calls another function. Remember, this one returns impl bundle, button base returns impl bundle. So all in all, regardless of how complicated the code is here, what's happening at the end of the day is that we are returning bundles of components. In this case in particular, in this button, they're trying to abstract the creation of an observer. So we have children spawn with. I have a video on these spawning APIs on the channel if you're unfamiliar with them. And then they are observing that action that got passed in. So these generics are just serving to be able to let you pass in a specific observer. You don't have to use these, but they are available to you, and you can return your own impl bundle functions to use in different places in your UI. We talked a little bit about the asset loader abstraction before. This is a abstraction that is only in this template. It's self-contained inside of this file, so if you want to read the whole implementation, you can. It's inspired by Bevy Asset Loader. So if you are a person who is okay with using third-party crates, you may just want to upgrade from the implementation in this template to Bevy Asset Loader directly. But the core idea here is that you can define some kind of struct and then load it later. You can see this in practice with these level assets. So source demo level. In this case, the level assets is a resource that defines a dependency on an audio source, so it plays some music. If you run this template locally yourself, you'll have heard the music already. And then there's a from world implementation, which is kind of like default with access to the world that lets you load in these handles. And again, all of these different areas of the application are abstracted into a bunch of different plugins, which are all written in this function plugin style. All the code in the demo folder is probably code that you end up getting rid of, depending on what your application is going to do, what game you're going to build. You'll probably want to extend the credits.rs with some additional information. This scene or the screen, if you will, is already set up for you, so you can just add, the name and what they worked on, or the asset and where it came from, and so on and so forth. The other thing that I would mention is that inside of the theme directory, there is a custom abstraction for an InteractionPalette and a couple of systems for applying that to different buttons. So overall, that's pretty much it. There's obviously more code that we could have gone over, but I'll leave that to you to read if you want to. We covered all the big high-level patterns. We covered how to get it onto itch. We covered some of the configuration that comes in these additional editor config folders. We covered the workflows. Just remember to tag your releases and it'll go straight up to itch. I encourage you to, if you're using this for the Bevy Game Jam, to get it onto itch as soon as possible, and then try to deploy at least once a day. More often is typically better. Do development with Bevy Run Web. And if you feel like you have time, maybe test in a couple different browsers. And of course, if you want to be experimental, go check out hotpatching with subsecond. We covered that a little bit earlier, but you can go check it out in the README as well. It's very cool. You can get sub 1 second Rust code reload times in a running application. You do have to compile and run natively, so you have to use Bevy Run instead of Bevy Run Web. And I would additionally caution, if you're new to Bevy, probably don't try to use this. If you have built Bevy applications before and know what you're doing and are comfortable with running into an error here or there, then definitely go check it out. It's very cool, but it is very new, very experimental work. And that's it for Bevy New 2D. If you're participating in the Game Jam, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you on Saturday when the Jam theme is announced. Have a great rest of your day.